Most people think Confucianism was a philosophy. It was, but that's not why empires kept it alive. Virtue, harmony, respect your elders, find your place in the order, all of that is real. But in Chinese history, Confucianism also did something else, something that looked like virtue, but also worked as power. It made power feel legitimate. Power can force obedience. Only legitimacy can make obedience feel natural. That's the difference between a system people comply with and a system people believe in. And it's part of why a political tradition survived dynasties, collapses, foreign conquests, and ideological revolutions, not only through force, but through a language people willingly spoke. In the last episode, we watched legalism win China's stress test. 7 states, 250 years, one brutal question. Which governance system actually scales? Legalism passed. It unified the empire. And then the dynasty it built collapsed in 15 years. Not because the laws failed. Because force alone cannot give people a reason to believe. Fear can control behavior. It cannot manufacture legitimacy. The Han Dynasty inherited the legalist kernel, and they faced a problem no law could solve. How do you run an empire of 50 million people without needing to coerce every single one of them? The answer was Confucianism. But not Confucianism as philosophy, Confucianism as a legitimacy layer, a moral interface installed between power and the people. Confucianism did not replace legalism, it gave legalism a face that people could accept. And if that sounds ancient, look carefully in the modern world. Every large system still needs a moral language, not just rules, but a story that makes the rules feel right. This is how China installed that language. The Qin dynasty passed every test of power. It won the stress test. It ended 3 centuries of fragmented warfare. It built roads, standardized weights and currency, unified millions of square kilometers under a single administrative grid. By the governance metrics of 2021 BCE, the Qin looked like a success. So why did it collapse in 15 years? That question haunted every Han official who came after, because the collapse didn't come from outside, it came from inside. Shang Yang's legal code was ruthless, consistent, and scalable, but it had a design flaw no law could fix. It could tell you exactly what would happen if you disobeyed. It could not tell you why you should obey. In 209 BCE, according to the traditional account, a group of conscripted farmers were delayed by flooding. In the traditional account, late arrival meant death. The penalty was clear. What was missing was any recognized path between the subject and the state, any moral language for appeal, any shared story about why the law deserved compliance. So Chen Sheng did the only thing the system left him with. He said, kings, generals, nobles, are these titles something men are born into? And then he started a rebellion. The Qin didn't fall because its people were disloyal. It fell because the system gave them no reason to be loyal. There was no moral language, no shared story about why the state deserved to survive, no interface between power and the people living inside it. Fear can maintain order, but fear is expensive. It requires constant surveillance, constant enforcement, constant pressure. The moment you ease the pressure, even briefly, the cracks appear. Legitimacy is cheaper. A person who believes the system is right will enforce it on themselves. A community that accepts the moral logic of order will do half the state's work for free. That was the gap the Han needed to fill. Not replace the legalist kernel, keep it, but install something on top. Something that could make 50 million people feel not just forced, but convinced. And here is a cost that no one in the Han court said out loud. A language that makes obedience feel meaningful can also make disobedience feel immoral. The same interface that builds legitimacy can make dissent look like a moral failing. That cost was built into the design from the beginning. We'll come back to it. 134 BCE. Emperor Wu of Han summoned scholars to court. He was 30 years old, ambitious, and facing a problem his father and grandfather had not fully solved. The legalist kernel worked, but the empire needed a language. A scholar named Dong Zhongshu became attached to the answer. He did not invent this transformation alone, but his name marks the moment when the Han state began turning Confucianism into official moral language. Not to dismantle the machinery Xiangyang had built, not to replace centralized power, but to give that machinery a moral vocabulary. The result was a shift in official learning. Confucian classics moved to the center of state education. A national academy was established. Scholars trained in other traditions were pushed away from the core of government. In the language later remembered by history, Ba Chu Bai Jia, Du Zun Ru Shu, dismiss the 100 schools, honor Confucianism alone. What the Han installed was not simply a philosophy. It was a three-part rewrite of how power justified itself. First, power became moral. Under the old system, the emperor was the strongest force, the man whose state had survived the stress test. Now, imperial authority was framed through heaven, through a cosmic moral order that could grant legitimacy and withdraw it when the ruler failed in virtue. This gave subjects a way to understand why obedience was right, not merely why it was required. Second, unity became sacred. Before, centralized rule was a legalist design choice. After the Confucian installation, unity became part of the moral structure of the world. Fragmentation was not only politically dangerous, it was disorder against heaven. The kernel's defining feature, centralized control, now had a moral face. Third, hierarchy became ethics. Confucian relationships, ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, were mapped onto the political order. Serving your superior was not just duty, it was virtue. Knowing your place in the order was not merely submission, it was moral cultivation. This is why the Confucian installation was effective, and why it was durable. It did not just control behavior from the outside, it moved inside. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because Confucius, the man whose name now stood on the empire's moral charter, had not designed this. Confucius wanted virtue to constrain power. In his vision, the relationship between ruler and subject carried obligations in both directions. A ruler who failed in virtue weakened his moral claim to loyalty. A minister who witnessed wrongdoing had a duty to remonstrate. The Confucianism of Confucius was at least partly a moral check on power. What the empire installed was structurally different. The weight shifted. Obedience upward became clearer than accountability downward. The language of moral duty flowed more easily from ruler to subject than from subject back to ruler. The emperor's mandate came from heaven, not from the people below him. The vocabulary was Confucian. The architecture was not. Confucius had wanted morality to restrain power. The empire used morality to serve power. The empire did not adopt Confucius. It rewrote him. A generation before Dong Zhongshu, a philosopher named Jia Yi had already named the design principle. Ritual prevents wrongdoing before it occurs. Law punishes it after. Law is reactive. It waits for a violation, then responds. Ritual, the moral vocabulary Confucianism provided, is preventive. It shapes the person before the violation becomes possible. When a subject has genuinely internalized the logic of the hierarchy, the state does not need to coerce them at every moment. They begin to enforce it on themselves. But how do you get millions of people to internalize it? Not just by preaching, by making the moral language useful, by making it the road to status, office, income, and family honor. The Han did not yet have the mature imperial examination system that later dynasties would build. But the direction was set. State education, classical learning, and the idea that political talent should be filtered through Confucian mastery. Over centuries, this logic hardened into the imperial examination, Keju. The imperial examination is usually described as China's meritocratic system. That framing is not wrong, but it misses the deeper structural function. The exam did not just test intelligence. It tested mastery of the Confucian canon. At different times, the canon changed. The 5 classics, later the 4 books, and generations of commentaries layered on top. To pass, to enter government, to gain status, to lift your family, you had to spend years, sometimes decades, not just reading these texts, but absorbing them, arguing within their logic, thinking in their vocabulary. The state did not need to force every ambitious family into this path. If you wanted to matter, if you wanted power, income, honor, or any path your family could respect, the road ran through mastery of the moral language. The mechanism is almost elegant in its self-sufficiency. The state created a competition for Confucian mastery, then put the winners in charge of maintaining the system. The people most deeply installed with the moral vocabulary became the officials who wrote the judgments, settled the disputes, taught their sons the same canon, and evaluated the next generation of candidates by the same standards. The UI had learned to reproduce itself. And this is where the double structure becomes visible. The Confucian language ran on the surface, in public ritual, in official rhetoric, and how men described their duties. Beneath it, the legalist machinery continued to function, in tax collection, military conscription, administrative discipline, and the actual machinery of punishment. Both layers were real. Neither was simply a disguise for the other. They served different functions within the same system. Emperor Xuandi of Han spoke about this privately, around 70 BCE, addressing his heir about how the dynasty actually worked. The Han dynasty has its own system, a blend of the way of the king and the way of the hegemon. How could we rely on pure virtue alone? Ba Wang Dao Zazhi, a deliberate combination, not a compromise, a design choice. The Confucian moral language in public, the legalist enforcement logic in practice. The emperor knew both layers were running. He simply did not advertise the second one. Not the same institutions, not the same ideology, but a recognizable structure. Moral language above, administrative force below. When you change the UI but keep the kernel, the OS is still running the same code. Before we look at what this system became, a step back. The Confucian installation is sometimes read as uniquely Chinese, as if building a moral language over a power structure were something only one civilization attempted. It was not. Every large system needs a UI. Corporations call it culture, platforms call it community guidelines, states call it core values, or national identity, or civic virtue. Any system that relies on millions of people to behave in predictable ways, without coercing every single one of them, needs a moral language. A story about why the rules deserve compliance. China's version is unusual not because it exists, but because it is old, because it has survived so many different regimes and ideologies, and because it became so deeply moralized, so tied to what people believed a good person was. That durability shows up in places you might not expect. But before the examples, one note. These examples do not prove the system is good or bad. They show what the system is optimized to measure. Conflict reduced before it becomes visible. Virtue assessed before authority is granted. Order maintained before law has to appear. In China today, there is a governance model called the Fen Qiao experience. Feng Qiao Jingyan. The core principle: small disputes stay in the village. Larger disputes stay in the township. Conflict should not escalate upward. Community mediators draw on the language of harmony, relationship, and moral obligation to resolve disagreements before they reach the formal legal system. Jia Yi's formulation from the 2nd century BCE still describes the logic. Ritual prevents before law punishes. At its best, this reduces friction before it hardens into legal conflict. At its worst, it can pressure people to settle before their grievances become visible. In some local civil service evaluation systems, moral character is still given a measurable score, in one Beijing framework as much as 20%. The specific virtues assessed include loyalty, integrity, dedication, and impartiality. The canon changed. The selection logic remains recognizable. The system still tries to filter for people who have internalized the moral vocabulary, then places them inside the machinery of governance. In Khufu, the city where Confucius was born, local mediation networks have been built around the language of harmony. Official reports describe hundreds of mediation rooms, tens of thousands of disputes processed, high resolution rates, and villages designated as litigation-free. The point is not whether these numbers prove justice. They show the metric. Conflict should be absorbed before it becomes litigation. The UI has not disappeared. It has been translated into modern administrative form. Which brings me back to something I said earlier and told you we would return to. In the Qin collapse, I noted that the same moral language carries a cost built into its design. A language that makes obedience feel meaningful can also make disobedience feel immoral. The same vocabulary that gives people a story about why the system deserves to survive can make it harder to say out loud in public, with moral standing, that the system is wrong. This is not an argument against moral language. Every system needs one, but it is worth naming the asymmetry clearly. A UI designed to make compliance feel natural is also, by design, a UI that can make dissent feel unnatural. That cost is structural. It is not unique to China. It is built into every system that successfully installs its moral logic into the people living inside it. China's version has been running for 2,000 years. The consequences, on both sides, have had time to compound. If the function of the UI is to make people believe the system deserves to be obeyed, what happens when the system loses that credibility? When the gap between the moral language and the actual behavior of power becomes visible enough that people stop finding it convincing? China's operating system has an answer to that question. It has a built-in legitimacy check, a mechanism for recognizing when the installation has failed and what the people living inside it are authorized to do next. It is called the mandate of heaven, and that is next.